Lila Johnson, CEO of Skyward Aviation, boards her flight craving a rare escape from the public eye. Yet from the moment she settles into her first-class seat, hushed whispers and wary glances make her question if she truly belongs. When a flight attendant abruptly asks her to move, Lila senses more than a simple mix-up, there's a palpable tension suggesting she's out of place. Despite her high-powered status, she now faces a new challenge, fighting for the privacy and respect she's earned. Where are people watching? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more compelling stories. Lila Johnson, the CEO of Skyward Aviation, boarded her flight in the early hours of the morning, ready for a much-needed respite. She had spent years building Skyward from a small regional airline into one of the leading players in the global aviation market. It had been a long, relentless journey, and today, for the first time in a while, she wasn't flying to a business meeting or investor presentation. This flight was personal, a rare opportunity to disconnect and find a moment of peace. As Lila settled into her first-class seat, she couldn't shake the feeling of being under a microscope. There was something unsettling about the attention she was drawing from the other passengers. It wasn't the sort of admiration she was used to in her professional life, where people respected her authority and accomplishments. This felt different, like they were watching her with a mix of curiosity and judgment, wondering if she truly belonged in this exclusive space. The whispers were subtle, but they were there, rippling through the cabin as her fellow travelers tried to steal glances at her. Lila had always been accustomed to attention. As the face of one of the most successful airlines in the world, she was often the subject of news stories and interviews. However, being in the position of power had its drawbacks. People often looked at her as if she were an object to be scrutinized, an enigma to be dissected. Today, however, she wasn't a businesswoman, she was just another passenger on a commercial flight, yearning for normalcy and the simplicity of anonymity. The flight attendants moved gracefully down the aisle, their eyes quickly assessing each passenger's needs. But when one of them, a woman named Erin Brooks, glanced at Lila, there was a noticeable pause. Erin's eyes flicked between Lila's face and the seat number, a subtle but distinct recognition. It didn't take long before Lila saw Erin approach her with a smile that seemed forced, as if it were an act she'd performed countless times before. "Excuse me, ma'am," Erin said, her tone polite but unyielding. "I'm afraid we have an issue with your seating assignment. There seems to be a mix-up with the reservation. Would you mind switching seats with another passenger?" Lila's brow furrowed, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. She had meticulously chosen this seat for the comfort and quiet it promised. She had earned the right to sit here, after all. It was a long flight from Los Angeles to New York, and Lila needed rest. She wasn't about to let a minor inconvenience spoil it. But something in Erin's voice made Lila pause. It wasn't just a request, it felt more like a directive, an underlying pressure that suggested Lila was out of place. "I believe there's been a mistake," Lila said, trying to keep her voice calm. "I'm in the seat I reserved." Erin hesitated, then glanced at the passenger manifest she was holding. Lila could see the flight attendant's eyes widen for just a moment, as if recognizing the name on the ticket. Erin's smile faded slightly, and Lila knew at once that she had figured it out. She was Lila Johnson, the woman who had built Skyward from the ground up. The recognition didn't come as a surprise, it was something she had grown used to over the years. But it still felt jarring, especially now, when all Lila wanted was to be left alone. "I apologize, ma'am," Erin said, her voice softening. "There was no mix-up. It's just that we have a policy about the allocation of first-class seating. It's complicated, but we're just trying to follow the rules." Lila's discomfort grew. She understood that the airline had rules, but there was something about Erin's demeanor that felt like an accusation, as though she didn't belong in first class. She had worked hard to get where she was, to make Skyward one of the most successful airlines in the world. And now, here she was, being treated as though she were an imposter in a seat that was hers by right. As the seconds stretched into an awkward silence, Lila felt the weight of the stares around her. She was used to being a public figure, but not like this, not in such a vulnerable, exposed position. For the first time in years, she felt the sting of judgment. The flight, meant to be a reprieve, was starting to feel like a reminder of the price of success. No matter how far she had come, she was always being watched, always being questioned. Lila Johnson had always prided herself on building Skyward Aviation into a company that transcended the traditional boundaries of the aviation industry. From its humble beginnings as a small regional carrier, the airline had grown under her leadership to become a major player on the global stage. The company's success was the result of years of hard work, sacrifices, and a relentless pursuit of excellence. But even with all her achievements, Lila still found herself struggling to balance her personal life with the demands of her career. Today, as she sat in the first-class cabin, her mind wandered away from the business empire she had spent years crafting. The flight was a brief respite from the ceaseless whirlwind of meetings, presentations, and decisions that consumed her life. Lila had booked the ticket not to attend another business event or corporate summit, but simply to take some time for herself. She had long ago realized that her work, while rewarding, had left little room for her personal needs. The irony of it all wasn't lost on her. Lila had sacrificed so much of her personal life to build Skyward. Relationships with family members, friends, even her own happiness, everything had taken a back seat to the relentless pursuit of success. It was a pattern she had repeated time and time again, believing that if she just pushed a little harder, just worked a little longer, she could achieve the next milestone. But now, as she stared out the window of the airplane, Lila couldn't help but wonder what she had sacrificed in the process. Her journey to this point had been one of constant ambition. She had faced countless challenges along the way, obstacles that would have stopped most people in their tracks. But Lila wasn't most people. She had fought against the odds, building Skyward from a regional carrier into an international competitor. She had done it with grit and determination, but it had come at a cost. She had made her name in the aviation world, but there were moments, like this one, when Lila found herself questioning whether it had all been worth it. The truth was, she hadn't known how to stop. There was always the next challenge, the next hurdle, the next problem to solve. And now, as she sat on this flight, Lila found herself longing for something she couldn't quite put her finger on, a sense of peace, perhaps, or a way to find balance between the professional success she had achieved and the personal life that seemed just out of reach. As the flight attendants moved down the aisle, Lila's thoughts were interrupted by a quiet, persistent tug at the back of her mind. Despite her resolve to leave her business behind for a few hours, the reality of her situation crept in. She had received a call from her assistant before she boarded the plane. There had been a troubling development at Skyward, one that required her immediate attention. A major business deal, one that had been in the works for months, was suddenly at risk. The deal was crucial to the future of the airline. It would expand Skyward's reach into international markets, bringing in a wealth of new customers and opening up new revenue streams. But now, it seemed like the deal was on the verge of falling apart. Lila knew that she couldn't ignore the situation. She had to act quickly, but the thought of diving back into work just as she had begun to unwind was frustrating. Despite her best efforts to relax and disconnect, the corporate world continued to demand her attention. Skyward's success had come at a steep price, and Lila was reminded of that with each passing day. The personal time she had hoped to find on this flight felt increasingly distant, overshadowed by the looming crisis that awaited her back at the office. As the plane soared through the sky, Lila realized that finding balance in her life would be far more difficult than she had ever imagined. Lila Johnson felt the tension in the air before the flight attendant even reached her. Her instincts, honed over years of dealing with the intricate dynamics of high-pressure situations, told her something wasn't right. She had settled into her first-class seat, attempting to relax, but the subtle buzz of discomfort around her made that impossible. The other passengers in the cabin, while maintaining outward composure, were exchanging furtive glances. A sense of unease had taken root, and Lila could feel its presence settling around her like a thick fog. It wasn't unusual for people to recognize her, given her position as CEO of Skyward Aviation. She was used to the whispers and glances. People were curious about her, even if they didn't know exactly what she did or why she mattered. But today, the attention felt different. It wasn't just admiration or intrigue, it was almost as if she were an intruder in a space she had every right to occupy. Lila brushed the thoughts aside, choosing to focus on the flight ahead. But then, as expected, the flight attendant approached. Lila glanced up to meet her eyes, offering a polite smile. The woman, her name tag read Erin Brooks, returned the smile, but there was something in her eyes that made Lila feel uneasy. "Excuse me, ma'am," Erin said, her voice polite but with a slight edge that made Lila sit up straighter. "I'm afraid there's been a slight issue with your seat assignment." Lila's brow furrowed. "What kind of issue?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unsettling sensation in her chest. She had carefully booked this seat months in advance. There was no way a mistake had been made. Erin's lips parted slightly, as if searching for the right words. "It seems there's some confusion in the system," Erin continued, her gaze flicking to the seating chart in her hand. "We need to ask you to switch to a different seat." Lila's patience began to wear thin. She had been looking forward to this flight, to the quiet reprieve it promised. Now it seemed that even this small bit of solitude would be taken from her. "I believe I'm in the seat I reserved," Lila replied firmly, her tone taking on a sharper edge. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, their curiosity palpable. She hated this, hated the way they were watching, waiting for her to react, to give them something to talk about. Erin glanced down at her seating chart again. "Yes, you are, but," before Erin could finish her sentence, the captain of the flight, an older man named Edward Ford, approached. Lila's gaze shifted toward him, and she could immediately sense that something had shifted in the air. Captain Ford was a professional, his manner dignified and authoritative, yet there was an air of caution about him as well. "Is everything all right here, Erin?" he asked, his voice steady and calm. Erin hesitated for a moment, as though considering whether or not to involve the captain in the situation. Finally, she nodded. "There seems to be some confusion regarding the seating, sir. I was just asking Ms. Johnson to move to another seat." Captain Ford's expression remained neutral, but his eyes flicked to Lila, and in that brief moment, she saw the recognition there. He knew who she was. It was inevitable, really. Lila Johnson, the woman who had turned Skyward Aviation into a global leader, was hard to miss. But the way he looked at her made her feel as though she were somehow a problem to be solved, rather than a respected business leader. "I see," Captain Ford said, his tone now warmer but tinged with the hint of formality. "Ms. Johnson, if you don't mind, I'd like to speak with you for a moment." Lila's mind raced. What was going on? Why was she being asked to move from her seat? Was this some kind of mistake, or was there something more to it? She had 1,000 questions swirling in her head, but she nodded and stood up. She wasn't about to make a scene, not when she didn't fully understand what was happening. But the growing tension between her and the flight crew was palpable, and it made the air in the cabin feel thick and suffocating. As Lila and Captain Ford moved to the side of the cabin, she could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, their silent judgment weighing down on her with every step. She had spent years building an empire, only to find herself now in this strange, vulnerable position. She had become used to the high stakes of boardrooms and negotiations, but here, on this plane, she felt something she hadn't expected, exposed. "Ms. Johnson," Captain Ford began, his voice softening, "I recognize you, of course. It's an honor to have you aboard. But I'm afraid there's been a slight misunderstanding. Erin here was simply following protocol. We've had some issues with the seating assignments, and it seems there's been a mix-up in the system." Lila's pulse quickened. "A mix-up," she repeated. "But I've reserved this seat for months." There shouldn't be any issue with the assignment. Captain Ford nodded, acknowledging her point. I understand, and I'm sure it's frustrating. However, we're going to need to move you to a different seat. It's simply a matter of balancing the cabin, you see. Lila's frustration mounted. Balancing the cabin? You're telling me that because of some logistical issue, I need to move from my seat? She could feel her temper rising, but she kept it in check. She had worked too hard for this moment, and she wasn't about to let a trivial issue like a seat assignment derail her. Please understand, Captain Ford continued, his voice carrying a note of sympathy, it's not about you. It's just that sometimes these things happen. We want to make sure everything runs smoothly. Lila's eyes narrowed. And how exactly does moving me from my seat help anything? She asked, the sarcasm creeping into her voice. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. Here she was, in a seat she had every right to occupy, being told to give it up for reasons she couldn't fathom. Before Captain Ford could answer, Erin stepped forward. If you'd like, I can help you find a more comfortable seat in business class, she offered, her voice almost too sweet. Lila glanced at Erin, then back at Captain Ford. The situation had become ridiculous. There was no reason for her to leave first class. She had earned her place there, just like everyone else who had booked a seat. But this was more than just a seat assignment issue, it was the subtle, almost invisible line of microaggressions that Lila had spent years dealing with. People didn't expect her to be here. People didn't expect her to take up space. Lila took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She was no stranger to difficult situations, but this was starting to feel personal. She had to wonder, was this truly an issue with the seating, or was there something else at play? Her mind raced with the possibilities. Is this really necessary? Lila asked, her voice steady but firm. Can we resolve this without further complications? As she looked into Captain Ford's eyes, she realized something, he wasn't going to back down. Neither was Erin. They had made their decision, and now it was up to her to decide how she would handle the situation. Lila straightened her shoulders and looked around the cabin. She could feel the weight of the other passengers' eyes on her, but she refused to let them dictate her actions. She wasn't going to let this small battle defeat her. I'll move, Lila said, her voice unwavering. But I expect an explanation when we land. I've worked too hard to be treated like this. As she walked back to her new seat, Lila's thoughts swirled. Something wasn't right about this entire exchange. She had learned to trust her instincts, and they were telling her that there was more to this than a simple seat mix-up. But what was it? And why did it feel like she was being tested in ways she hadn't anticipated? Daniel OOA sat quietly in his seat, his gaze fixed ahead of him as he observed the scene unfolding before him. From his vantage point, he could see everything, the tension between Lila and the flight crew, the way the other passengers were watching with bated breath, the subtle exchange of glances between the flight attendants. The moment was charged with an energy that, to most people, would seem like just another minor disruption in the routine of air travel. But to Daniel, it was something much more. He had been observing Lila Johnson long before the altercation over the seat began. She had caught his attention the moment she boarded the plane, her presence undeniable. He knew exactly who she was. The CEO of Skyward Aviation, one of the most powerful women in the business world. And while others might have seen her as just another high-powered executive, Daniel saw something different. He had been trained to read people, to understand their behavior, their motivations. And Lila Johnson intrigued him. She had the look of someone who had worked tirelessly to achieve everything she had, someone who had made countless sacrifices to get to where she was. But there was something more, something that Daniel couldn't quite place. It wasn't just her outward success or her sharp business acumen. It was something deeper, a quiet intensity that seemed to surround her. As the altercation continued between Lila and the flight attendants, Daniel's mind started to turn. He had been assigned a mission of his own, one that had nothing to do with Lila's identity or her company. But the situation on the plane seemed to have an unexpected connection to his real objective, a connection he hadn't anticipated. The discomfort he had felt when he first recognized Lila now seemed to make sense. The tension in the cabin, the attention focused on her, it was all part of a larger narrative that was beginning to unfold. He kept his eyes on the scene, his mind whirling with possibilities. What was Lila Johnson's role in this larger puzzle? Was she just another piece in a corporate game, or was she connected to something far more significant? As the minutes passed, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that his mission and Lila's presence on the plane were somehow linked. He knew he had to keep watching, keep observing. The answers were out there, and he was getting closer to finding them. But for now, all he could do was wait. Lila Johnson's pulse quickened as she made her way to the back of the plane to take her newly assigned seat. She had been forced to move, to give up the spot she had meticulously chosen for this flight, and she wasn't sure whether it was the frustration or something deeper, something more ingrained, that made her feel unsettled. She could feel the weight of the passengers' eyes on her as she passed by them. They weren't just curious, they were watching her, waiting for her to react. As if somehow, she was the anomaly. Her gaze swept over the cabin as she moved down the aisle. The entire situation felt bizarre. A woman who had spent years building an empire, who had achieved things many only dreamed of, was now being treated as though she didn't belong. It was a moment she had experienced countless times in her life. The looks, the subtle jabs, the feeling of being out of place when in reality, she had every right to occupy the space she was in. She had fought for it, sacrificed for it, and yet there were always those, whether it was in the business world, the media, or even in everyday interactions, who still made her feel like an outsider. As Lila sat down in the new seat, she tried to push the thoughts aside. She didn't need this distraction. She was here to rest, to escape for just a few hours from the relentless grind of her corporate responsibilities. But that wasn't going to happen. Not when she was constantly reminded of the price she paid for success. The flight attendant, Erin Brooks, approached once more. This time, Erin's demeanor was more composed, but there was still something about her that seemed to carry an underlying tension. Lila wondered if she was being scrutinized, judged in ways that didn't seem fair. She had worked for every bit of her success, and yet, here she was, being asked to move because of a seat mix-up. Was that truly the reason? "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, Ms. Johnson," Erin said, her voice softening, though Lila could detect the faintest hint of something else in her tone, an unease, perhaps? Or was it pity? "I know this must be frustrating for you." Lila wanted to respond, to speak her mind, but she stopped herself. The truth was, she had been down this road before. She had been in this exact position countless times. It wasn't just the flight attendants or the passengers she had to contend with, it was the internal struggle, the battle within herself to not react, to not let her anger and frustration show. "I appreciate your understanding," Lila replied, forcing a smile as she crossed her arms and leaned back in her seat. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating, but she wasn't going to let it consume her. She would take this in stride, as she always did. But that didn't mean it didn't hurt. As the minutes passed, Lila's thoughts began to shift. She had spent so much of her life trying to prove herself in a world that often doubted her because of her gender, her race, and her success. She had built Skyward Aviation into an international leader in the airline industry, but none of that mattered in this moment. No, in this moment, she was just a woman being asked to leave a seat she had earned. The whispers and sideways glances of the passengers around her began to build into a crescendo, the subtle microaggressions that Lila had come to expect in situations like this. There was the older woman 2 rows ahead of her, who kept glancing back, her gaze lingering for just a second too long. There was the businessman across the aisle, who had given Lila a dismissive look when she first boarded, as if he couldn't quite understand how someone like her could afford to fly first class. There were the young professionals who exchanged a knowing glance when Erin had asked Lila to move, as though they shared a silent understanding of what was really going on. Lila had faced these subtle biases and judgments her entire life. It had started when she was a young girl, the daughter of immigrants, trying to carve a space for herself in a world that was constantly telling her she didn't belong. It continued through her rise in the corporate world, where every step up the ladder was met with skepticism and disdain from those who believed she was an outsider. And now, in this moment, on this plane, she felt the sting of those same microaggressions once again. As the flight progressed, Lila's frustration grew. She wanted to say something, to call out the way she was being treated, but she knew it wouldn't make a difference. She had learned that speaking up often only made things worse. People didn't want to hear about the struggles of successful women, particularly women who didn't fit the mold. They didn't want to acknowledge the invisible barriers that had been placed in front of her, or the way her achievements were so often minimized or dismissed. Instead, she kept her thoughts to herself, focusing on the task at hand. She was in the air, headed toward New York, and there was no turning back. She couldn't afford to dwell on the small injustices. She had bigger problems waiting for her back at Skyward, after all. There was a corporate crisis brewing, and she had to be prepared to face it head-on when she landed. But that didn't mean she wasn't affected. The microaggressions, the subtle judgments, these things had a way of chipping away at a person over time, of making them question their worth, their place in the world. Lila had spent years building a thick skin, but moments like this reminded her of the weight of the battles she had fought and the ones she would continue to fight. By the time Lila reached her new seat in business class, her mind was no longer focused on the flight. The frustration of the seat mix-up, the tension in the cabin, and the subtle judgment from the other passengers had all piled up, leaving her feeling drained. The quiet, peaceful flight she had been hoping for was now a distant memory. Instead, her thoughts turned back to the looming crisis back at Skyward Aviation. Her assistant had called her just before she boarded the plane, and the news had been unsettling. Edward Morgan, a powerful investor with significant stakes in Skyward, had threatened to halt the acquisition talks they had been negotiating for months. The deal was supposed to be a game-changer for the company, bringing in a new wave of investors and expanding Skyward's presence in international markets. But now, Morgan was saying that unless certain financial concerns were addressed immediately, he would pull out, leaving the entire acquisition in jeopardy. Lila had tried to push the news to the back of her mind as she boarded the plane, hoping to get some rest. But now, with the plane in the air and no way to escape her thoughts, the weight of the situation came crashing back. Skyward's future was at stake, and it was all on her shoulders. As she sat in her seat, her phone vibrated with another incoming message. It was from her CFO, Rachel Summers. The subject line read, "Urgent, Morgan's concerns." Lila opened the message and read it quickly, her heart racing as she absorbed the information. The financial issue Morgan had raised was significant, and it involved a potential shortfall in Skyward's liquidity. If the company didn't find a way to resolve the issue, Morgan would not only pull out of the acquisition but could also move to sell his shares in the company. That would send Skyward stock into a tailspin and leave them vulnerable to a hostile takeover. The email went on to outline a few potential solutions, but none of them seemed simple or immediate. The issue would require a deep dive into the company's finances, a thorough investigation into their cash flow and long-term projections. It wasn't something that could be fixed with a few phone calls or quick meetings. It was going to take time, and time was something Lila didn't have. The tension in her chest tightened as she thought about the stakes. If Morgan backed out, it could mean the end of everything she had worked for. Skyward's reputation would take a huge hit, and the employees who had built the company alongside her would be left to pick up the pieces. It would be a devastating blow to the airline and to Lila personally. But as much as she wanted to dive into the details of the financial crisis, she couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. The situation with Morgan felt too convenient, too sudden. Lila trusted her instincts, and they were telling her that there was more going on than just a financial issue. Could it be corporate sabotage? Had someone at Skyward tipped Morgan off to the weaknesses in their financials? Or was there something deeper, something more strategic at play? The more Lila thought about it, the more convinced she became that this wasn't just a matter of bad luck or poor planning. Someone was orchestrating this crisis, pulling the strings from behind the scenes. And if that was the case, she needed to figure out who was behind it, and fast. She closed her eyes, trying to think through her options. There was no way to resolve this while she was in the air, but once she landed, she needed to get to work immediately. She would need to bring in her top financial analysts, her legal team, and the senior executives who were closest to the deal with Morgan. They would have to dig deep into the company's books and figure out what had gone wrong, and who was responsible for this mess. But that was only part of the equation. Lila also knew that there was someone inside Skyward who had a vested interest in seeing the acquisition fail. It could be a rival executive, a disgruntled board member, or someone from outside the company trying to take advantage of Skyward's current vulnerability. Whoever it was, Lila was going to find out, and they were going to pay for it. As the plane soared through the sky, Lila's mind was racing. She had always been a woman who thrived under pressure, but this was different. The stakes had never been higher. The future of Skyward was hanging in the balance, and if she didn't act quickly, everything she had built could come crashing down. The flight felt like it lasted an eternity. But finally, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their descent into New York. Lila looked out the window, taking in the sprawling city below. She knew what she had to do. The fight for Skyward's survival was just beginning, and she was ready to do whatever it took to protect the company, and her legacy. Lila Johnson couldn't shake the unease that had settled into her chest ever since receiving the news about Edward Morgan's sudden threat to pull out of the acquisition talks. It wasn't just the financial issue at play, it was the timing. Everything seemed to have fallen apart too quickly. Too conveniently. She had been in this business long enough to know that things didn't just fall apart by themselves. The more she thought about it, the more she became convinced that this wasn't a simple financial mishap. Something, or someone, was actively working to undermine Skyward. As the plane began its descent toward New York, Lila's mind raced. She was no stranger to corporate battles and the ruthlessness of the business world. She had fought off competitors, navigated hostile takeovers, and outsmarted investors who tried to push her around. But this felt different. This wasn't a typical business negotiation gone awry. This was sabotage. Someone was orchestrating a crisis, and Lila had to figure out who, and why, before it was too late. The more she considered the situation, the more she realized that the issue with Morgan wasn't the only red flag. There had been other strange occurrences in recent weeks, minor things that, at first, had seemed like typical business hurdles, but in retrospect, felt more like pieces of a larger puzzle. A key senior executive had resigned unexpectedly, citing personal reasons, but Lila knew that the timing was odd. Then, there was the leak of confidential financial data to the press, just days before Morgan's warning. It was all starting to connect in her mind, and the pattern didn't look good. As the plane touched down and taxied toward the gate, Lila pulled out her phone, dialing Rachel Summers, Skyward CFO. She needed answers, and she needed them fast. "Rachel, it's Lila. I need to speak with you as soon as possible." "It's urgent," Lila said, her voice sharp with the edge of urgency. "I'm landing in an hour. Get the team together." Rachel's voice crackled over the line. "Understood. We've been looking into the situation with Morgan, but things aren't adding up. I'll meet you at the office." Lila ended the call and leaned back in her seat, staring out the window as the sprawling skyline of New York came into view. She knew she had to act fast. She couldn't afford to wait for the full investigation to unfold. If this was sabotage, if someone within Skyward was working against her, she had to flush them out before they could do more damage. The feeling of being hunted, of being undermined by someone within her own company, wasn't one Lila was used to. She had spent years building Skyward into a global leader in aviation, and the thought of internal betrayal gnawed at her. Who could it be? Who within her inner circle would want to bring everything crashing down? She thought of Trevor Wilson, Skyward's chief operating officer. Trevor had been with the company since the beginning, and Lila trusted him like a brother. Or at least, she had trusted him. But recently, his behavior had seemed off. He had been distant, preoccupied with other matters. Lila couldn't shake the feeling that he had been hiding something. Was Trevor involved? Or was he another pawn in someone else's game? The plane finally came to a stop at the gate, and Lila stood up, collecting her things and heading toward the terminal. As she made her way through the airport, her thoughts continued to swirl. She had dealt with countless challenges in her career, but this felt personal. Whoever was behind this sabotage was trying to take away everything she had worked for, everything she had built from the ground up. By the time she arrived at the office, the team was already gathered in the conference room. Rachel, along with the legal team, financial analysts, and other senior executives, were waiting for her. Lila took a seat at the head of the table, her gaze sweeping over the room. Everyone was looking to her for guidance, and she knew that the time to act had come. "We need to talk about Morgan and the acquisition," Lila began, her voice steady and commanding. "I've been thinking about this, and something isn't right. This is more than just a financial issue. This is sabotage, and I need to know who's behind it." Rachel nodded, pushing a stack of financial documents toward Lila. "We've been reviewing everything, and there are some inconsistencies. It looks like someone may have deliberately leaked financial data to the press. It wasn't a public release, it was a targeted leak to stir up doubts about our financial stability." Lila's eyes narrowed. Who had access to that information? Rachel hesitated. The only people who would have had direct access were our senior management team. "It's highly classified." Lila's gaze shifted to Trevor Wilson, who was seated at the table. He was unusually quiet, his face unreadable. Could he be involved? Lila wasn't sure, but she knew one thing: this wasn't a time for hesitation. She needed to find out who was behind the leak, and fast. "We're going to go through everything," Lila said, her voice firm. "I want every communication, every document, every person who had access to this information over the past 6 months. Nothing gets overlooked." Trevor shifted in his seat, but didn't say anything. Lila watched him closely, her mind racing with the possibility that he might be the one working against her. If he was, it would be a devastating blow. Trevor had been with Skyward through thick and thin, but this was a different situation. If he was involved in sabotaging the company, there was no turning back. "Lila, we're going to need to dig into every angle," Rachel added. "We've already started looking at the other key players involved in the acquisition. Morgan isn't acting alone. Someone else is pulling the strings behind the scenes." Lila's mind raced as she processed this information. This was bigger than just Morgan. Someone within Skyward was orchestrating this, someone who had access to everything, from the confidential financial data to the inner workings of the acquisition talks. Whoever they were, they had to be stopped. "We'll do whatever it takes to get to the bottom of this," Lila said, her voice colder now. "I'm not going to let anyone tear this company down." The meeting continued, with the team outlining their next steps and forming a plan to investigate every lead. But in the back of her mind, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that Trevor was hiding something. She had to find out what it was, and she had to do it quickly. Skyward's future depended on it. Lila Johnson's mind had never been so focused, yet so clouded at the same time. As the hours passed in the meeting, she found herself weighing every word, every decision, every move she would make from here on out. It wasn't just about corporate sabotage anymore, it was about survival, her company's survival, her legacy, and her reputation. After the meeting with her senior team, Lila's immediate task was clear: get to the bottom of the sabotage. As she walked back to her office, her thoughts were consumed by the faces of those in the room, their expressions, their hesitations. Lila had seen it all before: the subtle signs of guilt, the guarded answers. Someone in her inner circle was betraying her. The question now was, who? Her phone buzzed, and Lila glanced down. It was an email from Rachel Summers, titled, Key Insights into Trevor's Activities. The subject made her stomach tighten. If Trevor was involved, it would be the worst possible betrayal. He had been with Skyward for years, and Lila had trusted him like a family member. She clicked the email open and scanned the contents. Rachel had compiled a list of recent communications between Trevor and several individuals outside the company. Some of them were obscure names, people Lila didn't recognize. Others were well-known competitors in the aviation industry. Trevor had been in contact with them more than once over the past few weeks, and the messages had raised a red flag. They appeared to be casual exchanges at first glance, but Rachel had managed to pull out a few keywords and phrases that made the situation far more concerning. Lila's mind raced. This wasn't just a coincidence. Trevor had been secretly communicating with Skyward's competitors. But why? Was he trying to broker a deal with them behind her back? Or worse, was he working to undermine her company from within? The pieces were starting to fit together. Determined to find answers, Lila immediately called Trevor into her office. When he arrived, he was his usual composed self, but Lila could see the nervous tension in his posture. She didn't waste any time. "Trevor, I've seen the communication logs," Lila said, her voice cold and direct. "What's going on? Why have you been in contact with our competitors?" Trevor's face paled, and for the first time, Lila saw something she hadn't noticed before: fear. It was subtle, but it was there. Trevor wasn't as calm and collected as he appeared. He was hiding something. "Lila, I can explain," Trevor began, but his words faltered under the weight of her gaze. "I don't want explanations, Trevor. I want the truth. What's going on?" Trevor hesitated before finally speaking. "I've been working on a backdoor deal, Lila. One that could save Skyward from the financial crisis we're facing. I've been in talks with global airlines about a merger." Lila's heart sank. "A merger? With a competitor? Why didn't you tell me about this?" she demanded, the anger and betrayal burning through her. "Why did you keep this from me? You've been sabotaging the company, haven't you?" Trevor's shoulders slumped, and he sighed deeply. "No, Lila, it wasn't like that. I was trying to protect the company, but I didn't know how else to handle the situation. The acquisition talks with Morgan were falling apart, and I thought this might be a way to salvage things without you getting involved." Lila's mind spun. Trevor had been trying to save the company, but at what cost? She had trusted him, and now, he had crossed a line. The realization that her most trusted ally had been secretly negotiating with the enemy was devastating. Yet, somehow, Lila knew that Trevor was just a part of a much bigger scheme. This wasn't just about a merger, it was about control. With a deep breath, Lila stood up from her desk, her resolve solidifying. "You've put everything we've worked for at risk, Trevor. You've betrayed my trust, and that's something I can't overlook." She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words sink in. Trevor looked up at her, regret and guilt evident in his eyes. But it was too late. Lila had made up her mind. "I'm removing you from your position as COO," Lila said, her voice final. "Effective immediately." Trevor opened his mouth to protest, but Lila cut him off. "I don't want to hear it. You've made your choice." With that, Lila turned away, her back to him as she gazed out of the window. She had done what was necessary to protect Skyward, but the betrayal still stung. This was only the beginning, and she knew the battle ahead would be a long one. But as she looked out over the city, Lila felt a new sense of clarity. She had the strength to face whatever came next, and she would stop at nothing to protect her company. Lila Johnson sat in her office, staring at the array of documents and reports in front of her, but her mind wasn't focused on the numbers. The crisis at Skyward Aviation was reaching a fever pitch, and every decision she made seemed to carry the weight of the company's future. Yet, just beneath the surface of the corporate chaos, another storm was brewing, the personal one that she had spent so many years pushing aside. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her mother. "I spoke to your father. He's in town. He wants to meet." Lila sighed. Her estranged father, Philip, had always been a difficult figure in her life. Their relationship had been fraught with tension for as long as she could remember. Philip had been a successful businessman, but his love for his daughter had always been conditional, based on her accomplishments, her ability to live up to the expectations he had set for her. Growing up, Lila had learned that her father's approval was something she had to earn, not something that was freely given. For years, they had barely spoken. Philip had made his feelings clear when Lila chose to build Skyward Aviation. He had wanted her to follow in his footsteps, to take over his legacy, but Lila had chosen a different path. One of independence. One of building her own empire. And now, just when she was facing the most significant challenge of her career, he was back in her life. Lila's hand hovered over the phone. She wanted to ignore the message, to focus solely on the crisis at hand. But she knew that ignoring her father wasn't an option. The tension between them had been festering for too long, and it was time to face it. She took a deep breath and dialed her mother's number. "I'll meet him," Lila said before her mother could say anything. "But it has to be soon. I can't afford distractions right now." Her mother's voice softened. "I know, sweetheart. But sometimes, we need to face the past to move forward. I hope you can find some peace." Lila hung up the phone, feeling the weight of her decision. She knew the meeting with her father wouldn't be easy. In fact, she was dreading it. But she also knew that she couldn't keep running from her past. She had spent her entire career burying her personal life beneath the demands of Skyward, and now, that balance was crumbling. The storm was no longer just professional, it was personal as well. Later that day, Lila met her father at a small cafe in the city. The moment she walked in, she saw him sitting at a corner table, his silver hair perfectly combed, his posture still as commanding as ever. He looked almost exactly the same as he had the last time she saw him, but there was something different in his eyes, a weariness that wasn't there before. He stood up as she approached, his expression neutral, but there was a flicker of something, regret, maybe, beneath his gaze. "Lila," he said, his voice as steady as ever. "It's been a long time." She nodded, taking a seat across from him. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, a lifetime of unresolved tension. Finally, she spoke. "I don't know what you expect from this meeting, Dad," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I've worked my entire life to build something for myself. I didn't do it for your approval." Her father's expression tightened. "I know that. But you can't keep ignoring the fact that we're family, Lila. I've always been proud of what you've done, but you've always kept me at a distance. You don't have to do everything on your own. You can't, and you know it." Lila's heart pounded. This was it, the confrontation she had been avoiding for so long. Her father was right, in a way. She had always prided herself on her independence, but maybe, just maybe, she had shut out the people who cared about her the most in the process. The question now was whether it was too late to fix things. "I built Skyward because I wanted to prove to myself that I could," Lila said, her voice softer now. "But I don't want to keep doing this alone. Not anymore." Philip looked at her, his eyes searching. "Then why are we still so distant, Lila? Why haven't you come to me for help when you've needed it most?" "Skyward could have used my connections, my experience. I thought I could do it without you," Lila admitted. "I thought I didn't need anyone's help, especially not yours. But now, things are falling apart, and I don't know who to trust." Philip reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. You've always been the strongest person I know, Lila. But even the strongest need help sometimes. Lila met her father's gaze, and for the first time in years, she saw a glimmer of the man she had once looked up to. Maybe it wasn't too late for them to mend their relationship. Maybe there was a chance, just a small one, to move forward together. "I'll need your help," Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Skyward's future is at risk. We're facing sabotage, and I don't know who's behind it. I need you to help me figure out who we can trust, and who we can't." Her father's grip tightened around her hand. "I'm with you, Lila. We'll figure this out. Together." For the first time in a long while, Lila felt a sense of relief. The weight of her personal and professional struggles was still heavy, but at least she wasn't facing it alone anymore. She had her father's support, and for now, that was enough. The morning after her meeting with her father, Lila Johnson felt more resolved than she had in weeks. The tension of the previous days still weighed heavily on her, but she now had a clearer sense of what she needed to do, both personally and professionally. With the corporate crisis at Skyward Aviation escalating, the stakes had never been higher, but Lila was determined to fight for the company she had built from the ground up. She walked into the office, the weight of her father's promise still fresh in her mind. He had agreed to help her, to provide the support she so desperately needed in this fight for Skyward's future. But she knew that his influence alone wouldn't be enough. She had to act strategically, outmaneuvering those who sought to tear down everything she had worked for. Lila sat down at her desk, scanning the reports and messages that had flooded in overnight. The situation with Edward Morgan was far worse than she had anticipated. Morgan had made it clear that he was ready to back out of the acquisition talks unless Skyward could prove its financial stability. The company's reputation was on the line, and it was up to Lila to keep the deal from falling apart. She knew that Morgan wasn't acting alone. There were other players involved, people with their own agendas, and Lila needed to figure out who they were before they could strike again. The first step was to gather information, to understand who was behind the financial sabotage and why they had chosen this moment to attack. Lila gathered her most trusted team members in the conference room, her mind already focused on the task at hand. Rachel Summers, the CFO, was first to speak. "We've been working around the clock to stabilize the financials, but we still don't know who's been leaking information. I've asked for a full audit of every department that had access to the data, but we're still getting a lot of pushback." Lila nodded. She had expected this. The sabotage was coming from someone within Skyward, someone who had the power to access sensitive financial information. She had to figure out who it was and cut them off before they could do any more damage. "We need to take the offensive," Lila said, her voice steady but firm. "We can't just wait for them to make their next move. We need to identify the source of the leak, and we need to act fast." Rachel leaned forward. "What's the next step?" "I want you to get in touch with our legal team and our head of security," Lila replied. "We're going to launch an internal investigation, and we're going to make sure that no one, absolutely no one, can take down Skyward from within." Lila paused for a moment, thinking about the people she trusted most. Her thoughts turned to Trevor Wilson, her former COO, and the secret negotiations he had been holding with Global Airlines. She had already removed him from his position, but she needed to make sure that no one else at Skyward had been compromised. "This isn't just about financial stability," Lila continued. "It's about trust. We need to rebuild the foundation of this company, and that starts with knowing who we can rely on, and who we can't." As the meeting went on, Lila outlined her strategy to take control of the situation. She wasn't going to let anyone tear down Skyward, not while she was still standing. She would fight, not just for the company, but for the legacy she had built. When the meeting adjourned, Lila was exhausted but determined. She had a long road ahead of her, but she was ready to face whatever challenges came next. Skyward was more than just a company, it was her life's work. And she wasn't about to let anyone take it from her. Life often feels like a balancing act, with the personal and professional constantly pulling us in different directions. We strive for success, pouring everything we have into our careers and dreams. But somewhere along the way, it's easy to lose sight of the very things that give us peace: our personal relationships, our sense of self, and our moments of rest. Lila Johnson, a successful CEO who built Skyward Aviation from the ground up, found herself in a similar struggle. Despite her immense success, she faced the realization that personal sacrifices, family, happiness, and balance, had taken a toll. Lila's journey reminds us that success isn't just about achieving professional milestones, it's also about finding harmony in our lives. No matter how high we climb or how much we achieve, we are all human. The quiet moments of reflection, like Lila's brief escape on a flight, show us how vital it is to disconnect and remember who we are outside of our work. Yet, even in those moments of much-needed respite, we can be reminded that the world still judges, scrutinizes, and questions our place in it. The small battles we fight, against societal biases, the weight of expectations, and internal struggles, are part of the larger fight for our peace of mind. Lila's story teaches us the importance of resilience. She wasn't only fighting for Skyward Aviation, but also for herself. Whether in the face of corporate sabotage or personal challenges, Lila confronted everything head-on. She made difficult decisions and didn't let adversity define her path. Life may pull us in many directions, but the most important thing is to stay true to our values, acknowledge our struggles, and continue moving forward. As we navigate our own journeys, let us remember that it's okay to seek support when needed and to rebuild the relationships that matter most. Whether it's facing a family conflict or a professional crisis, having the strength to confront these challenges with grace and determination will carry us through. Just like Lila, we must learn to trust ourselves and those who truly support us, as this is the foundation on which we build our future. If you enjoyed this story and found these lessons helpful, please make sure to like, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell for more. Your support means the world to me, and I appreciate you being part of this community. Let's keep growing together.